there is lots and lots and lots of debate on this subject, because gerrymandering is this kind of classic situation where, as the slide says, it's an eye of the beholder sort of problem. My perfect map looks like grossly unfair to you, and your perfect map looks grossly unfair to me. And, Phil Burton, who was a famous congressman from California, was responsible for drawing a map of California one year, and he referred to it as my contribution to modern art. And the idea here is that, gerrymandering is more like an art than a science, not so much in the drawing of the maps, but in some respects in the judging of the maps. So whether it's courts or legislatures or nonpartisan commissions, there are always these disagreements about whether a map is a fair map or not, because no one really knows how to assess whether a map is fair or not. And that's what I want to tell you about today. So the first thing I want to do is disabuse you of the notion that shapes matter at all. And this is where we have to begin by saying that the historical antecedents of the term gerrymander have done us no favors whatsoever, because they've led us in the wrong direction of thinking that a shape matters, but shapes don't matter at all. So to give you an example, here are 5 ridiculous shapes. And none of you will be able to recognize any of them unless you're really, really, really deep in the weeds. But they're all political boundaries. Only one of them is a congressional district. 4 of them are city boundaries, and they are Dallas, Texas, Columbus, Ohio, Madison, Wisconsin, Cheyenne, Wyoming, and the famous earmuffs district in Illinois, which was drawn not for partisan reasons, but in order to create a district which had a Latino majority, and it was drawn at court order. And the problem was that there were a bunch of Latinos living in the north side of Chicago and a bunch living in the south side of Chicago. There was not an easy way to link them together, because there were other groups, Blacks living in between, and you would have disrupted another group. And so in order to draw this district, you had to actually go all the way to the west to get to the highway and draw this district. So the district looks weird, but it there was no way to do it otherwise. So the point of all of this is just to say that weird shapes occur for all sorts of reasons that have nothing to do with partisan chicanery, right? Cities absorb surrounding areas willy-nilly because they can. Suburbs break away, often for weird reasons that we're not that proud of, because they want to. There are sort of unpredictable paths that natural phenomena follow, like physical features like rivers. And there are other goals in charge. So if you're just looking at shapes, it's going to be a really bad way to go about doing it. And some of the worst sort of kind of gerrymandering possible, I would argue, are the most regular shapes at all. So just erase shapes from your mind. So the alternative is to think about the actual goal of gerrymandering, which is to create an effect, which is to help the party that's drawing the map get more seats than it deserves out of a set of votes. When the Democrats gerrymander, they want more seats for their vote share than they would ordinarily deserve. When Republicans do it, they want more seats. So this leads to 2 questions. What's fair? And how do you measure it? So I'm going to take these 2 questions. Well, these sounds like 2 really simple questions. And of course, anytime you're confronted with 2 really simple questions, somebody like me, who's bald, will say, those questions aren't that simple. They're really complex. And they are complex questions, but I'm going to actually go in the opposite direction here and say, these are actually simple questions, and they have simple answers. And that's the whole point of this talk. So we'll start with what's fair, right? Suppose we have a district, or we have a state where a party gets 44, 51, 58% of seats. I just added by 7, right? What a percent of votes, I should say. What percent of seats should it get for those vote shares? I mean, the obvious answer is to say, obvious PR, proportional representation, 44, 51, 58. But that doesn't actually work out. So even countries that have PR systems, not ours, they have a variety of different ways of translating votes into seats. There's no sort of agreed upon formula. We don't have one anywhere. So Israel, for example, keeps on tinkering with different versions of the same thing, of this, in a way to try to fix the system. We don't have a kind of normative set of expectations. And so the bottom line is that we don't know how to answer that question. And even the court has said, oh, we don't know how to answer that question. That's a stupid question. Don't ask us to answer it. So I want to argue that the fallback position is something that's really, really stupid, really, really simple, really, really easy, really, really obvious. And that is to say, forget about the difference between 51 and 58. Let's just think about the difference of more than 50 and less than 50. Democracy means that the people rule, and we typically think of the majority ruling. So the basic argument here is very simple. If you get more votes than the other person, than the other side, you should get more seats than the other side. And so I want to address your attention to the simple principle of majority rule and say, this is what gerrymandering is about. It's about majority rule versus minority rule. How would we demonstrate that? So now we have a conception of fairness. We've answered the first of our questions. The second of our questions then is, how do we measure it? Well, so excuse me, there are pros and cons about this. It's super simple, but it's limiting in the sense that it doesn't help us if there's a state out there like Utah, where there are these allegations, or Massachusetts, where there are these allegations that the state has been gerrymandered to create, a majority Republican state is gerrymandered to create a supermajority Republican state, or a majority Democratic state has been gerrymandered to create a supermajority Democratic state, right? Okay, fine. Thankfully, there aren't a ton of those situations, and I would argue that they're not that important relative to the minority rule issue. We have a much bigger problem with states like my home state, Wisconsin, or Michigan, or Georgia, or Florida, or Texas, or on and on and on. That's sort of where the rubber really sort of meets the road here. And that's where 95%, probably 99% of the action is. So we've reformulated gerrymandering as this question of majority rule. So now the question is, how do we measure it? How do we detect it? So the obvious way is to say, well, hey, if a party gets more than 50% of the votes in an election, it should get more than 50% of the seats. So here's an actual example. In 2012, after the 2010 redistricting, Pennsylvania Democrats won 51% of the House votes, but only got 28% of the seats. Sounds really bad. The problem is in 2014, they received 44% of the votes, and they would receive 28% of the seats. So by my own standards, this sounds like this is an example that could go both ways. So does this mean, and the weird thing about this is that Pennsylvania Democrats went to court and got a court to agree that the state had been gerrymandered. And so by 2016, I can't use this example anymore because they redistricted, and I think they were right. So I can't use this example or these data. Does this mean that we're done? And the answer is, no, we're not done. The principle is still fine. The problem is this simple approach isn't the right approach. There's a much better approach. And the better approach here involves the evidence. And this is where I've lost Carrie before, but I'm going to get her back. I swear I'm going to get her back. There are two issues. One issue is the issue of elections. So it's really tempting to use legislative elections to measure, to examine legislative elections, the bias in legislative districts. But that's a big problem. And the problem is that there's these huge variations in context. So for example, like 30 or 40% of state legislative elections are uncontested. What do? Right? If Democrats don't even challenge, 30 or 40% of the seats for the Pennsylvania legislature, how do you use that kind of information to assess gerrymandering in that case? Or in the case of the US House, most US House races don't really have serious challengers, so that a party underperforms its real, true sort of partisan split in the electorate. So the solution is to use statewide candidates or jurisdiction-wide candidates. So, like how did the presidential candidates do in Pennsylvania, or the gubernatorial candidates, or the senatorial candidates? Instead of looking at House candidates, look at presidential candidates and see how well they did in districts. And look, the other problem here, though, is that we're counting seats. And the problem with counting seats is that, well, excuse me, the other problem here is that we're trying to measure anti-majoritarian bias. And what happens when you're doing this is that if you got a real purple state like Pennsylvania, the Democrats could go from winning 51% of the vote to winning 53% of the vote to winning 48% of the vote. And it suggests that the voters can sort of cure the problem by themselves just because of that. So it suggests that we don't really want to do it in as obvious a way as I did in that previous slide. So we need a solution. We need an approach which is better than comparing votes and seats, something that's more flexible, that can deal with circumstances that change. And the key here is to understand that we have a better way of measuring seats, not votes here, but seats, than by looking at the party's number of seats won. And that is by looking at essentially the tipping point seat. And if you think about it, that, if we're interested in winning majority control, the party that wins majority control has to win the 50th percentile seat plus one in order to win, right? Well, what that means is that if you sort of array all the seats from the most Democratic to the least Democratic, or the most Republican to the least Republican, the one that's smack dab in the middle is that seat that's right in the middle. That's the tipping point. It's the median. It's the tipping point district. It's the tipping point seat. And whichever party carries that median seat, the median district, is the one that's going to win control of the legislature. So here's so the median district represents the tipping point. And so instead of talking about a party winning X percent of the seats, we can talk about the party winning X percent of votes at the tipping point seat. That's our whole, I've been talking for 15 minutes, I think. That's the whole insight. It's literally the whole insight. The other thing is, a few slides ago, I talked about, the other part of this was the percentage of votes. Well, that's kind of unchanged, except I'm just going to make it a little bit easier and say the percentage of votes averaged across all the districts. So now we have, our array of districts in Pennsylvania or Wisconsin or New York or whatever have you. And we're going to have the Democratic mean or the Republican mean in all the seats, and the Republican or the Democratic median in all the seats. And we're just going to compare them. And that's the whole thing. So here's what I mean by this as sort of a simple example. Let's think of a state that has 7 districts, your typical 7-district state, of which there are like a couple of them, right? So here's a state where I just made it up, and the Democrats get 51% of the vote. I averaged it out, so that's the same in both ones. And Plan 1 is a completely fair map where the Democrats get 51% of the vote. And as you can see, the tipping point district is District 4, right? It's the 4th most Democratic or the 4th most Republican district in both plans. But in the first plan, the median 51 equals the mean 51, perfectly unbiased by our standards. But in the second one, which I've called the Republican gerrymander, the median equals 47 and the mean equals 51. And that means that the Republicans have carried 4 of the 7 seats. They've won control of the legislature, even though they've gotten 49% of the vote, not 51. And if you want to take this a step farther, the difference between 51 and 47-4 has a substantive meaning. It means that for the Democrats to have won that median seat, District 4, they would have had to win 50% of the vote plus 4%, that 51 minus 47 or 4, in order to carry this. I don't know if that makes a ton of sense, but we think of this in a bunch of different contexts. For example, in the Electoral College, we think of this. So the difference between Biden's performance nationally versus his performance in the tipping point state, which I think might have been Wisconsin in the last couple of years. He runs, 3 or 4 points ahead nationally than he runs in the tipping point state, which is the state that it represents the 270th electoral vote. It's the exact same logic. In fact, we've been writing about this for years, but I borrowed this language because I think or this verbiage because I think it's good verbiage. So the question is, so this is actually a relatively well-known thing. People have been writing about this for over 100 years as it happens, but they've been writing it in the context of stats. So if a distribution is unbiased, the median and the mean should about equal one another. But if it's biased or it's skewed, they won't equal one another. And this is something that's fairly easy to observe. So the question is, even if it's easy to observe in practice, even if all you need to do is get a bunch of election results broken down by district, throw them into a spreadsheet and calculate the mean, median, and subtract, and you're done. Does it tell you anything is it a good measure? And what I mean by is it a good measure is, does it work? Does it come up with sensible and stable estimates? And sensible means it's come up with estimates that make sense. I don't want to suggest that we're just going to throw away numbers when we don't like them, but we also don't want to come up with numbers that don't make any substantive sense. That is, if there's a 20-point bias, I'm not sure I'm going to buy that. And it's especially important because what's nice about this measure is that the results are directly interpretable. They have some meaning. The other thing is it stable? One of the things that I've argued here is that the district lines aren't changing. We should still see the same sort of bias. And the answer to these questions is yes and yes. And so 2 more slides to show you. And here's the first one. This is an example, one of many examples. We're up to like 8 or 10 publications, a group of political scientists and me, of which I'm one from Binghamton. This is a publication from American Political Research a few years ago. It's about the Wisconsin Assembly. And the reason we're writing about the Wisconsin Assembly is not because I'm from Wisconsin and know Wisconsin well. It's because Wisconsin and its assembly districts were the subject of a Supreme Court case. And what we did in this piece is that we did exactly what I talked about. We looked at the partisan breakdown of the vote in Wisconsin assembly districts. We were able to look across redistricting cycles. So we looked at the current maps using previous election margins, because previous election results, because we have these fantastic data. And we just checked the median and the mean. And what we found was that there's this pro-Republican bias, this difference between how Republicans performed in the mean vote versus how they performed in the median district in election after election, varying from about 4 points here to getting to around 6 points here. Pretty stable. What's interesting here is the elections themselves weren't that stable. So, the presidential 2008 race, Obama won by 11 or 12 points. There are a couple of races here where Republicans won by 11 or 12 points. So even when there's a big swing in outcomes, this bias is stable. And it means that for the Democrats who won the assembly, they would need to carry, for the Democrats to win the assembly, they would need to win 54, 55% of the vote in order to carry a majority of assembly districts. Republicans only need 45, 46%. That's a huge difference. And it's not one that's sort of supported by a bunch of other things in the state. It's not about political geography or anything like that. So that's where we're at. So I have a lot more to say, but I have a time limit. I'm not sure if I made it, but we'll see. So what I've convinced you of is gerrymanders can be easy to understand, and gerrymanders can be easy to detect. The most fundamental thing about them is that they don't guarantee that a party can win with a minority of votes, but they make it possible. They introduce this systematic bias, which is really sort of sustained across a variety of different things. So give me an opportunity to gerrymander a state, I can make it possible for a party to win, control and maintain control of that state with 44, 45, 46% of the vote. And that is a really serious affront to democracy. It's bad. We can detect it very easily with just a minimal amount of data and just a little bit of, calculation. I mean, I can teach grade school students how to do this with a little bit of work. I'm not sure if Carrie is going to believe that I can do it, but I think I can do it. I know I can do it. What's weird about this is this stuff has won awards. So my colleagues have won. They won a Common Cause redistricting award one year. The Common Cause did a prize, and then a couple of years later, when I was part of the group, we won, I think, second place. So I brought us down in this. We've got a whole bunch of publications. I told you, like, we're up to 8 or 10. But we have not yet made it to court on this. And it's so weird because some other measures have, and they're much worse than ours. They're terrible. And the Wisconsin case went into court with a measure which I got to tell you, it's really bad. But they did not use ours, and I met with the lawyers and they would not use ours. So what can I say? And then finally, of course, you want to come to Binghamton and learn more about this. It's true. It's true. It's true. But I'll stop talking. Carrie, did I do it in 25 minutes?
I think you got it, John. Thank you. I'm getting there.
Well, the thing is, I don't need to convince you. You're already here. I just need to convince these people.
Well, I'm talking about gerrymandering, but I think we'd like to ask anyone else if they have questions more about Binghamton, or maybe you can talk just a little bit about the political science department here, or Justin, Josh, Ileana, UT. If any of you have questions, please do feel free. If you're not comfortable coming on camera, certainly unmute yourself. I know John is happy to bicker with anybody, and we'd love to hear any questions you have about Binghamton, about research, about John's research, or other opportunities. But maybe while they're thinking, John, you could actually, okay, Ileana, what question do you have? Go ahead.
So I am considering going to Binghamton and possibly majoring in political science. So could you tell me a little bit about opportunities in research, internships, and just what some classes could be like as that kind of major? And then I have another question that might go a little into your political beliefs, because I'm kind of interested in seeing your point of view on something.
Okay, well, I'll start with the first one and I'll let you continue with the second one. So Poli-Sci is one of the better departments in Harper. We're nationally rated and all this other stuff. We have a good network of alums, which is useful. So we have, for example, I do American politics, obviously. And so I've got students who are working all over town and, all over Washington and all over New York City, for example, in government jobs and things like that. So that's helpful. So we've got sort of like a strong network doing those things. We do internships. We sponsor them. They usually work through Fleischman Center, I think it is. And so people sort of have to find them on their own, but they work through the Fleischman Center, and it's a pretty well-established process. The research stuff is kind of dicey. It comes and it goes depending on how things work. So I've occasionally had undergraduate research assistants who I've worked with, to do projects. The biggest issue is that I have projects that last for like 2 or 3 years, and I have undergraduate research assistants who last for like 2 or 3 months, and it's just hard to sort of fit those things together. So most of my research assistants have been grad students who have been sort of like in it for the longer term, but occasionally I've done some things with undergrads who have sort of been persistent and interested in have had longer term commitments. I tend to I don't have any real policies in the sense that somebody comes and says, I've seen what you're doing on this and I want to help out. And it's like, oh, okay. Then I try to figure something out. But the biggest issue is, like everybody else, we're facing a terrible money crunch. And so, I tend to think that people deserve to get paid for stuff. And I don't know, for at least in the moment, where we're going to come up with money to pay people. But we try to help out where we can. The poli-sci department has 3 sort of subfields. We have a 4th, but the 4th is kind of undeveloped. So the 3 are world politics, comparative politics, and American politics. And what we make you do is take at least one course in each of those 3, or the 4th, which is a political theory, which can sort of substitute. We have an adjunct, a long-term adjunct, who teaches a couple of courses a year in political theory, and that's sort of it. We have a lot of public law courses, but those are in the American politics field, so that's actually a pretty good thing. We've got a lot of sort of pre-lawyers doing that sort of stuff. But generally, it's a cohesive major in the sense that we also have required 2 capstone seminars for, well, mostly seniors, but sometimes juniors. So students take 2 400 level classes. They're capped at 15 students. They take them in residence. And probably about 75% of them are taught by faculty, and the other 25% are taught by advanced graduate students. And the problem here is we just, in order to get everybody into these seminars, we have to use graduate students, but we only use the ones that are pretty far along. So if you go into poli-sci, you'll meet faculty. If you go into other departments, it depends on the department. So what's your personal question?
So my other question is, while we're on the topic of, since we were talking about voting and stuff, with the facts of politics, what would happen if people decided that they said they would want to get rid of the Electoral College? How do you think that would affect how politics run if someone just got rid of it completely?
So here's the thing. So I'm old. I've come to grips with this. So I have a point of view on the Electoral College that predates the 2000 election. So I have not been a critic of the I'm not a Johnny-come-lately critic of the Electoral College. I'm a Johnny-come long time ago critic of the Electoral College. I think it's fundamentally, well, if you'll excuse me, a piece of shit, and it has no bearing on anything. So the Electoral College, first of all, we have to understand that it was born out of a completely misunderstood notion of how the elections were going to be run. So if you read the Constitution, the Electoral College was supposed to function like, the College of Cardinals and Catholics selecting a pope. It was about people coming together to actually have this deliberative process, the wise men of the time, and they were going to select the best person. And the problem is that George Washington said, I want to be president. And everyone said, we want to vote for George Washington. And they immediately defaulted to an election, and they never looked back. And so the Electoral College, as conceived of and as written about in the Federalist Papers by Alexander Hamilton, didn't exist for 1 millisecond in American history. So by 1804, because Thomas Jefferson hated Aaron Burr, as we all do now after Hamilton, right? He sponsored the 12th Amendment that said, basically, I don't want to have Aaron Burr anywhere near me anymore, because at the time, the vice president was a second place finisher. And they basically took the easy way out, which is to say, well, we have the Electoral College, so we'll just assign electoral votes to the states and make that easy. And that was it. It was like this afterthought. So people say, well, it reflects this grand design. No, it reflects this kind of lazy ass, I don't give a shit about, like I want Burr out of my house sort of thing.
I
So
didn't
the
even know
prob-
that. That's interesting to know.
Come to Binghamton. I will tell you more about all of this stuff. So the thing about this is, see, Carrie, I'm selling it, right? Oh, there you go. So the thing about this is that here's why I hate the Electoral College. New York sucks for voting. Sucks for voting. And New York doesn't give a crap about voting because the Democrats who run New York don't have any reason to give a crap about voting because the Democrats always win New York and they don't care about the margins of how much they win New York for by. Indiana sucks for voting. The Republicans who run Indiana don't care how much it sucks to vote in Indiana because the margins don't matter. They don't care whether the Republican carries Indiana by 500 million votes or 750,000 votes. The polls close in Indiana at 6 o'clock in the evening. 6 o'clock in the evening, my teenage daughter doesn't wake up until 6 o'clock in the evening. She would never be able to vote. Of course, she's still a teenager, but I don't even understand what this is about. So the Electoral College provides this negative incentive where there's no incentive for states to actually create mechanisms to get people to vote. And it's this perverse thing. I wanted incentives to actually have the Democrats and the Republicans in different states say, holy crap, we really want to drive out the vote, right? So if you think about why Republicans in places like Georgia and Texas and Democrats in California and so forth actually pioneered all of these great voting things, it's because local Democrats and Republicans in those places said, we have some electoral needs to actually get voters to the polls. Like the reason that Republicans were the champions of mail-in voting historically was because they're older than Democrats. And Republican politicians introduced mail-in voting and absentee voting, universal absentee voting, because they said, all of our geezers are going to really love this. And until 2020, they did. And then Trump said, I don't think I like this anymore, even though he was an absentee voter. And now they all hate absentee voting. And I don't understand it. It does not make any sense. But ultimately, we want a system that incentivizes people to participate. The Electoral College totally messes that up. I want the Democrats and the Republicans in states to say, we need more voters, more. And I just think that's crazy. Also, I've been to Pennsylvania. It's not that great. I don't know why voters in Pennsylvania count more than us.
Bunch of farmland.
I mean, seriously. I've
Things
met people from Pennsylvania and I asked them, it's like, why are you more important than me? And they go, you should know. I mean, look at you. And it's like, look at you. And then it's stupid, but yeah.
Any other questions before we wrap up? I think that was really helpful, John. I know a lot of your classes and a lot of students do enjoy taking them, even if you don't know much about it, because you get to think real thoughts and work with students of bright minds. That kind of want those same things and want to make change here at Binghamton. So I don't know if any other students have any questions. We've gone a little bit over, but I think this has been really helpful, John. Ileana, thank you for your questions. We really appreciate it. I'm going to put my email in the chat here, or our email for admissions, in case anyone wants it. And maybe, John, if you want to do the same, you're welcome to, or you can pose your questions to us and we'll get them to the place. So we're admit@binghamton.edu. I know we have maybe some students on here who are transfer students or might be still juniors thinking about where to go. So you've got a whole nother year to kind of.
I'll let you put my email on for me, and so you don't have to see my gigantic forehead as I move toward the screen and try
Okay.
to it.
Is it J. Krasno?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
At binghamton.edu.
Perfect. So you can reach out to either one of us any other questions, but thanks so much, John, for coming on and giving this talk. I thank you all for staying and for listening. We hope you have a great evening, and certainly.
So I have a question. You panned my first talk. How was my second talk? Is it any better?
It was a little better. I think I'm getting there.
So if I come in a third time, maybe I could finally get there.
Maybe third time's the charm. We might have to do gerrymandering one more time for me to really stick it.
Oh my God, it's just it is a really tough crowd here at Binghamton. They don't let you get away with anything.
That's right. That's right.
It's like they, when the admission staff are heckling the faculty, it's a real bliss. That's what I can tell you.
That's right. That's right. Well, thanks so much, John. We really appreciate it. And thank you, everybody. I hope you've had enjoyed some banter, enjoyed learning about gerrymandering. And we hope to see you here either in the fall or in the future. And thanks again, John. Really appreciate it. Have a great evening.
Thank you. This was very interesting and very helpful.
Great. I'm so glad to hear it, Eliana. We hope you to see you in the fall.
You'd have to wait another 2 years. I'm a junior this year.
Oh, so. 2 years. Okay, well, we'll keep at you then.
You mark it on your calendar, some fall or other.
That's right.
Fall or other.
There you go.
I'm hoping Binghamton opens for tours soon, because I would definitely love to see the campus one day.
Oh, well, we do have we do have self-guided tours right now. So if you wanted to come on campus and do it yourself, you could certainly do that. But hopefully by the summer and the fall, we might have more of those programs open too. So we'll keep you posted for sure.
It's coming.
It is.
Thanks again. Have a good rest of your night.
You too. Have a good night. Bye bye.